Chicago in the January of that year was a city of shut doors, and the boy standing in the snow didn't have a door of his own left to shut. He was 9 years old, and as of Tuesday morning he was homeless, truly homeless. The kind nobody believes happens to a child in a country like this. Because his mother had kissed his forehead on Friday night, walked out into the dark, and never come home, and by Tuesday the landlord had padlocked their little apartment in Pilsen over 3 months of unpaid rent, and everything the boy owned in the world now fit in one school backpack. 2 shirts, a photograph, and a battered leather notebook his mother had pressed into his hands that Friday night with one rule: if I'm not back in 24 hours, don't call the police. Find the people on this list. One of them will take you in. 12 names, 12 addresses along the rich, warm lakefront of Lake Forest, where the fireplaces glowed behind carved oak doors, and not 1 degree of that warmth was for a shivering kid on the wrong side of them. So he went knocking, a homeless 9-year-old in a jacket, 2 winters too small, and sneakers that hadn't been dry since Monday, asking the only thing he had left to ask. I don't have anywhere to go, can I please stay, just until my mom comes back? And 12 times, the same thing happened. They looked at his wet shoes and his old backpack, and they decided they knew him. Some figured he was hustling for yard work and said, "We're not hiring, kid." Some figured he was begging and shut the door before he'd finished his sentence. One woman told him through the doorbell camera that there were shelters for people like him, and a man in a golf sweater threatened to call the police on a child asking for a roof in 12-degree weather. 12 respectable families, 12 warm houses with empty guest rooms, and not one of them would take in a freezing boy for a single night, because taking him in meant trouble, meant questions, meant caring. And caring is the one thing a comfortable house learns to keep off its doorstep. He slept that night in a bus shelter with his backpack for a pillow, and in the morning he walked to the 13th address, the one that didn't match the other's no name beside it, just 2 initials in ink gone brown with age, written by his maternal grandfather, whom he'd never had the chance to know, a proud man who had died ruined and disgraced exactly the year before the boy was born, and beneath them, 5 words, the last one the only one who ever believed. The 13th door belonged to the biggest estate on the shore, black iron gates, cameras perched like crows on the fence posts, and a name every adult in Chicago knew and nobody said out loud, because the man who owned that house was 37 years old, wore $3,000 suits the way other men wore armor, commanded an empire half the city feared and the other half pretended not to see, and hadn't spoken a full sentence in public in 10 years. They called him the boss, who never talks. Some said he'd sworn a vow over somebody's grave. Some said he was simply the coldest, most ruthless man in Illinois, too dangerous to waste words on people he could erase with a phone call, and everyone agreed. His silence was scarier than any threat, because a man who says nothing can be planning anything. That was the door the homeless boy rang on the coldest morning of the year. And here's the part nobody in Lake Forest has ever been able to explain. The camera turned, the iron gate hummed open, and the most feared man on the lake stood in his doorway, looked down at a shivering child no decent family would take, and without one single word, no questions, no conditions, no hello, stepped aside and brought him in. Within the hour there was a fire lit in a guest room, hot food on the table, and new boots by the bed, and the boy who'd been turned away 12 times had a home, in the one house every mother in Chicago would have warned him to run from. 12 good families had closed their doors on a homeless child. A mafia boss who never speaks opened his, and the reason why lay inside that old leather notebook. In a dead man's handwriting the silent man had been hunting for 10 long years. Before we go on, if stories about quiet men with loud hearts get to you the way they get to us, hit that like button so we know you're out there. Share this one with somebody who still believes kindness doesn't need an audience, and subscribe to the channel, because there's a new story waiting for you here every single week. Now, let's get back to that frozen morning in Lake Forest, to the homeless boy, the notebook, and the 13th door that never should have opened. The kitchen of the mansion was larger than the old apartment he and his mother had once shared put together, and that was the first thing Sam thought as he sat before a steaming bowl of chicken soup and a plate of garlic butter bread that a silver-haired woman named Bettina kept refilling, even though he hadn't had time to finish what was already there. The kitchen ceiling was so high that he had to tip his head back to see the brass lamps hanging above him like small planets, and everything in this place was polished, silent, and clean to such a degree that he didn't dare rest his elbows on the stone tabletop. He was so hungry his hands trembled, but he ate slowly, one spoonful at a time, because his mother had taught him that a Kane boy, no matter how hungry he was, didn't eat like someone starving to death, and his back had to be straight, always straight. The tall man in the black shirt had disappeared after bringing him inside, and in his place was a broad-shouldered, square-faced man, about 40 years old, named Tommy Falco, standing against the doorframe with a phone in his hand. Every few minutes the phone gave a soft little buzz, and the man would read, nod to himself, then obey, sometimes telling Bettina to warm more soup, sometimes dimming the glaring light above Sam's head, sometimes bringing over a thick pair of dry socks. Sam watched, and little by little, he came to understand something strange. All those orders were coming from the master of the house, the man who didn't speak, and he gave commands by text even though he was somewhere right here inside the same building. Once, what Tommy received wasn't a text but a small white card delivered by a servant, and after reading the handwritten line on it, he raised his eyebrows, glanced at Sam very quickly, then slipped the card into his jacket pocket. Sam wanted to ask what it said, but he didn't dare. He was only 9 years old. But he was wise enough to know that in a house where grown-ups whispered, and the walls were this thick, children should look more than they asked. Then the kitchen door burst open, and a tiny old woman swept in like a March wind, her white hair pinned high, her black eyes bright and sharp, her mouth already speaking non-stop before she had even seen him, saying that the whole house was trying to hide the fact that they had a guest from her, saying that at 78 years old, if she wanted to know what was happening in her own home, she had to eavesdrop on the cook, which was absolutely unacceptable. She stopped short when she saw Sam, and for 1 second, that sharp, wrinkled face softened completely. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him, introducing herself as Carmela, the homeowner's aunt, the only person in this mute mansion who still knew how to use her tongue for its proper purpose, and then she asked him his name. Sam swallowed his piece of bread, straightened his back the way his mother had taught him, and answered that his name was Sam Kane. Mom. The old woman's hand froze halfway through pouring tea, only for a moment, so brief that an adult might have missed it. But Sam had spent 9 years of his life reading his mother's face every night when she came home from work, to tell whether it had been a good day or a bad one, so he saw everything, the teacup trembling faintly, the aged knuckles tightening around the handle of the pot, and those black eyes flicking for an instant toward the door, where Tommy Falco had also stopped tapping on his phone. Kane, the old woman repeated slowly, as though the name had a taste on her tongue, and then she asked what his mother's name was. Lydia, Sam answered, Lydia Kane. My mother is an auditor. She's the best with numbers in Chicago. Her boss said so. And then, because the old woman had eyes that knew how to listen, because the soup had warmed his belly, because for 4 days he had had to be a grown-up and he was so very tired, Sam told them everything. He told them about Friday night, how his mother came home earlier than usual, her face white as paper, how she closed the curtains before turning on the lights, something she had never done before. She knelt down in front of him, put the leather-bound notebook in his hands, and made him repeat the rules 3 times until he knew them by heart. If she didn't come back after 24 hours, don't call the police. Find the people on the list, and absolutely do not give the notebook to anyone except them. Then she kissed his forehead, told him she loved him, her brave boy, and stepped out into the dark. She had never broken a promise to him, he said, his voice still even. Though his small hands had tightened beneath the table, she promised she would come home. But it has been 4 days and she hasn't come home. And yesterday the building manager locked the apartment door, so I don't have a home anymore. But that's all right, because my mother had already told me what to do. My mother always tells me everything ahead of time. The kitchen went utterly still. Bettina turned her face toward the sink. Carmela placed her hand over Sam's small one and no longer chattered. And none of them noticed that in the dark threshold of the hallway, the man in the black shirt had been standing there for some time, motionless as a shadow, listening to every word the child said. He remained there for one more breath, his gray eyes resting on the old backpack hooked over the back of the boy's chair, where the leather-bound notebook lay silent as a waiting heart. Then he turned away without a sound. And only a few seconds later, inside Tommy Falco's jacket pocket, the phone buzzed again. well past midnight, when the entire mansion had sunk into a silence as thick as the snow outside. The only light still burning lay behind the walnut door of the study at the end of the second-floor hallway. Dario Lombardi sat behind the broad desk, the sleeves of his black shirt rolled up to his elbows, and before him, resting in the warm golden pool cast by the desk lamp, was the old, worn, leather-bound notebook the boy had agreed to lend him before going to sleep. After Dario had written him a card promising that he would only borrow it until morning, and that the Lombardi family had never broken a promise. He hadn't opened it for 2 hours. He had only sat there looking at it, the way a man looks at a door that has been closed for 10 years, and has now, without warning, opened just enough to let a thin blade of light through. Then he poured a glass of wine he didn't drink, put on his thin-framed reading glasses, and turned the first page. The handwriting appeared beneath the lamplight, numbers lined up as straight as soldiers on parade, small notes written carefully in the margins, precise, exact, proud, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who believed clean books meant a clean conscience. Dario's fingers stopped on a line of ink that had already browned with age, and it didn't move again for a very long time, long enough for the mantel clock above the fireplace to mark the hour with a soft chime. He knew this handwriting. He had searched for it for 10 years, across 3 continents, through storage warehouses that had burned under suspicious circumstances, through banks that had changed hands and law offices that had closed their doors, and now it was here, on his desk, carried halfway across the city in a school backpack by a 9-year-old child. This wasn't a copy, wasn't a disclosure statement filed with the court. This was the original ledger, the book all of Chicago believed had been destroyed before the trial. Dario took off his glasses, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, then stood and walked toward the wall of books on the east side, pulled on a false spine, and the steel cabinet hidden inside the wall opened with the soft click of an electronic lock. There wasn't any cash inside, no gold, nothing people imagined would be kept in the safe of a crime lord. Inside there was only paper, a massive mountain of paper, arranged in bundles tied with string, old bank statements, foundation meeting minutes, private investigator reports from 4 states, refusal letters from 2 law firms, and a thin leather envelope lying on top, set apart from everything else. He carried the envelope back to the desk, opened it, and took out a yellowed newspaper clipping, cut into a neat square and pressed flat as though it had been ironed once every year. An obituary, Mr. Frank Kane. Former chief accountant, passed away at his private residence, aged 52, funeral held privately with family. Years had passed since then. Only 3 lines, no accomplishments, no words of mourning, not even a photograph. 3 lines for a man who had kept clean books for half his life, because sometime before that, in a time that now felt like a lifetime ago, there had been a case that swallowed the entire rest of his life. Dario's finger slid over the faded printed words, and suddenly the room around him wasn't a study anymore. It was a hotel ballroom from those forgotten years, crystal chandeliers, 500 powerful people, and a young man in the finest suit he owned rising in the middle of dinner, his hands trembling but his voice not trembling, speaking aloud the thing no one wanted to hear. That young man had believed with all the untouched innocence in his heart, that the truth only had to be spoken for someone to listen. And then the laughter began, first a small chuckle from a far table, then spreading like fire, catching dry straw, the whole ballroom laughing, 500 of the most powerful people in Chicago laughing in his face, and one man's voice rising above them all, filled with poisonous indulgence, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive the Lombardi boy. Youth so often mistakes kindness for..." Dario set the obituary back down on the desk, and the ballroom vanished. The laughter went silent, and there was only the soft crackle of firewood in the study fireplace. He wouldn't allow himself to remember the rest, not tonight. He slipped the clipping back into the envelope, placed the ledger inside the safe, locked it, then sat down and took a plain white card and a fountain pen from the drawer. He wrote slowly, his handwriting upright and restrained, weighing each word the way other men weighed gold, saying that the boy's notebook was safe in his vault, that he would return it in the morning exactly as promised, and that if the boy couldn't sleep, the kitchen opened at 5 o'clock in the morning, and someone would be there making pancakes. That person didn't talk, but pancakes didn't need words. He walked down the dark hallway, placed the card neatly under the door of the bedroom, where the boy was sleeping deeply for the first time in 4 days. stood still before that door for one more breath, then returned to the study and picked up his phone. The message sent to Tommy Falco contained only 11 words, no greeting, no explanation, the kind of order the entire organization had spent 10 years learning to carry out without even a second of delay. Find Lydia Kane, 72 hours, mobilize everyone. At the far end of the mansion, Tommy's bedroom light came on after exactly 3 seconds, and somewhere out there, in the heart of the frozen city, a mother was counting to 3 in the dark without knowing that the most terrifying machine in Chicago had just started moving for her. While in the study, the man who didn't speak sat alone with the glass of wine he hadn't touched. And for the first time in 10 years, there was in those gray eyes the light of a man who had just seen a way out of his own grave. More than 20 miles southwest of the lakeside mansion, deep inside a rundown storage facility on the edge of Cicero, where rows of metal roll-up doors stretched one after another in silence beneath the sickly yellow glare of high-pressure lights, there was a discreetly converted storage unit with no sign to mark it, and inside that unit, on a folding cot pushed against a soundproofed wall, Lydia Kane was awake, just as she had been awake for nearly all of the past 4 nights. She was wearing the same office clothes from Friday night, her blouse already wrinkled, her hair tied back neatly with the same elastic band, because even here, in a windowless room with only one ceiling bulb and a camera mounted in the corner, she still got up each morning at the old hour, folded her blanket flat and tidy, and sat with her back straight on the edge of the cot as if she were waiting for a meeting. They didn't hit her. She understood very quickly that they weren't allowed to hit her, that someone behind all of this needed her whole and alert, and that fact told her more than any beating could have, because people only take care of something they still need to use. What they used instead was time, the light bulb that never went off, the meals pushed through the slot in the door at no fixed hour, so she would lose all sense of day and night, and the small speaker mounted on the ceiling, where several times a day a voice came through, a voice distorted by a machine, neither old nor young, neither male nor female, patient as a call center operator, asking the same 2 questions over and over. Where was the audit evidence she had copied? And where was her father's notebook? The first question she had been prepared for since Friday night. The second question was the one that made her blood turn cold the first time it was asked, because it meant this had never been only about an audit. It was about 11 years ago, about the buried grave she had accidentally driven a shovel into when her firm accepted a review of the Ruggiero Foundation's books, and she, the lowest-ranking employee on the team, was the only one who noticed that those old numbers were singing one wrong note that only Frank Kane's daughter could hear. They knew about her father. They knew the notebook existed, which meant the person behind that speaker was the same one from back then, or the heir of the one from back then, and it meant her father had been right from beginning to end, right even when he went to his grave, with a 3-line obituary no one bothered to read. Each time that voice came on, Lydia did only one thing. She looked straight into the camera, said she didn't understand what they were talking about, and then fell silent, and in her mind, she counted to 3. 1, 2, 3. Her father had taught her that back when her whole world collapsed in a single spring during her youth, when her college friends stopped answering her messages, and she quietly withdrew from school to come home and hold her father's hand on the nights he sat staring at the wall. You count to 3, her father had said, not so the fear goes away, but so the fear knows it doesn't get to decide for you. Those early hardships had been a blur of grief and betrayal, forcing her to grow up long before her time. She had counted to 3 in the delivery room, a young mother alone in the world, when the man who had promised everything vanished before their child was even born. She had counted to 3 throughout the long years that followed, the years of waiting tables by day and studying accounting by night with her little boy asleep, on 2 chairs pushed together at the back of the classroom, the years of eating after her son was full, and wearing old clothes so he could have new shoes, because she had sworn on her father's grave that his grandson would grow up on his mother's honest work, not on anyone's pity. And on that Friday night, she had counted to 3 too. She remembered every second clearly. The gray sedan parked at an angle across the street for 3 straight days, the man reading a newspaper inside the car, though his eyes never moved along the lines, and the phone call dropping 3 times in a row when she tried to reach a coworker on the audit team, signs that meant nothing separately but, placed beside one another, screamed only one thing: they had found her. She had 10 minutes to choose, and she used those 10 minutes to close the curtains, kneel down at her son's eye level, place his grandfather's notebook into his small hands, and make him repeat the rules 3 times. Not 2, not 4, 3 times, until every word lay still in his memory the way numbers lay still in a ledger. Then she kissed his forehead, stepped out into the darkness, and deliberately turned the other way, walking slowly enough for the gray sedan to start up and crawl after her, without any of them bothering to glance back at the 3rd-floor window, where a little boy was pressing his forehead to the glass. They took her at the end of the 4th block, smoothly and professionally, and she didn't fight, because every step they dragged her away was another step they moved farther from her son. Now, on the 4th night, lying there and staring at the light bulb that never went dark, Lydia Kane didn't pray for herself. She reviewed the plan in her mind the way she reviewed a balance sheet, line by line, and everything balanced. The boy knew the rules. The boy had the list. The boy was stubborn and smart and so much like his grandfather that watching him hold a pen made her want to cry. And at the end of that list was an address she herself had never knocked on. Only 2 initials and a line written by her father, the last one, the only one who ever believed. She didn't know who those 2 initials belonged to. Her father hadn't had time to tell her, and she had never been brave enough to find out on her own. But her father had never written down a single unnecessary number in his life. 1, 2, 3. "My son will find the 13th door," she whispered to the light bulb, and in a place she could not see, the camera in the corner of the wall shifted its lens slightly, as though at last, after 4 days, the straight-backed woman had just said something that made whoever was watching lean closer to the screen. That morning, while Sam was sleeping off 4 sleepless nights behind the safe walls of Lake Forest, a man in a charcoal wool coat walked into the office of his old elementary school in Pilsen, placed a Chicago Police Department detective badge on the counter, and smiled the smile of a man who had been taught all his life that a smile could open more doors than a search warrant. Ray Muller looked exactly like what people wanted to believe a good cop looked like, past 50, salt and pepper hair neatly cut, a low, warm voice like a grandfather in an insurance commercial, and his badge was real. His 27 years of service were real. The only thing false was the reason he was standing there. He told the secretary that the department was coordinating a child welfare check, that a student named Sam Kane had been absent for several days, and his mother wasn't responding, that he only needed to know when the school had last seen the boy, which friends the boy was close to, and whether the boy had been carrying anything unusual with him, perhaps a box or a notebook. The secretary, trained to cooperate with the police, had answered the first 2 questions before the 3rd had time to trouble her, because in 20 years of work, no welfare officer had ever asked what kind of notebook a missing child might be carrying. People asked whether he had eaten, whether he was warm, not what his backpack contained. Muller read that hesitation in her eyes, thanked her politely, left his card, and walked out before the question could fully form, because a skilled hunter never stays longer than the moment the prey begins to notice. His next stop was the 3-story brick building in Pilsen, where the door of the Kane mother and son's apartment still wore the landlord's brass lock, and at the top of the 3rd-floor stairs he met Mrs. Kowalski, 70 years old, in fuzzy slippers and a sweater buttoned all the way to her throat, watering her potted plants with a little watering can, like a fortress that knew how to move. Muller showed the badge again, used that same warm grandfatherly voice again, saying, "Mom, I'm very worried about the Kane boy. Neighbors look out for one another, so you probably know where he likes to play, where his relatives live, or whether he left anything with you for safekeeping." Mrs. Kowalski had lived 70 years in this world, and 40 years in Pilsen. She had seen enough kinds of men hold enough kinds of papers across her threshold, and she recognized this smell at once, the smell of a proper question asked by the wrong eye. More importantly, she remembered that Friday night with perfect clarity, Lydia knocking on her door at dusk, her face white, gripping both of the old woman's shoulders and saying, "Mrs. Kowalski, if anyone comes asking about Sam, anyone at all, even someone in uniform, please don't say anything. Just say my son and I went back to the countryside." So the old woman braced the watering can against her hip, narrowed her eyes at Muller from head to toe with perfectly rehearsed confusion, and launched into a long rambling story that, Oh, that Kane girl, yes. She moved to Indiana with her aunt. Officer left last week. Rented a whole truck. Poor girl worked herself to the bone. And since you're here, officer, I should also report that the second-floor hallway light has been burned out for 3 weeks and nobody's fixed it. Please put that in your report for me. Muller stood there another 10 minutes, listening as the old woman drifted from the light bulb to her grandson in Poland, without giving him one more useful word, until at last he had to retreat down the stairs, and Mrs. Kowalski stood by the window watching until his car had disappeared completely, her hands shaking, but her back straight. Then she turned back into her apartment, opened a drawer, looked at the Christmas photograph of Sam with his mother that Lydia had given her, and made the sign of the cross. That same afternoon in Lake Forest, Tommy Falco knocked on the study door with a tablet in his hand and the face of a man carrying bad news, then placed 3 long-distance photographs on Dario's desk: Muller at the school gate, Muller in front of the Pilsen building, and the gray sedan that their men recognized as having been parked for 2 straight days 1 block from Sam's old school, changing positions every 6 hours but never moving beyond sight of the gate. Tommy spoke briefly. Someone else is looking for the boy too, sir. And they're not looking to save him. They were ahead of us at the apartment, behind us at the school, and this cop asked about the notebook, using the exact words only someone who knew the notebook existed would use. Dario listened to all of it, his eyes never leaving the 3 photographs, his index finger tapping one slow beat against the wooden desk, the kind of rhythm Tommy had spent 10 years learning to read. And then Dario pulled out a card, wrote 4 lines in his familiar upright hand, and pushed it across the desk. The boy doesn't leave the grounds until further notice. Double the men at all 3 perimeter rings. Put 2 people on Mrs. Kowalski discreetly. She just lied to the police for us. And find me everything on Ray Muller. 27 years of service. I want to know which year he began spending more than his salary. Tommy nodded and turned to leave, but stopped at the door when the phone in his pocket buzzed. A new message from the very man sitting behind him. Just 1 line, 56 hours left. And while the lakeside mansion quietly turned into a fortress without the sleeping child, inside knowing a thing, 20 miles away, in a car parked beneath the shadow of leafless trees, Ray Muller lit a cigarette, opened his official notebook, crossed out the 2 addresses he had already visited, and circled the 3rd address, the one he had saved for last because it was the hardest, and beside that blue ink circle, he slowly wrote 2 initials, DL. On his 2nd night in the mansion, Sam woke while the sky was still pitch black, and this time it wasn't because of a nightmare, but because of something stranger. He woke because it was too quiet. For 9 years of his life, he had slept to the sound of car horns drifting in from the avenue, the heater coughing and clanking, and footsteps from the people upstairs, so the silence of Lake Forest, thick as a quilt, made him toss and turn as if something necessary had gone missing. He lay there staring at the strange ceiling for a while, missing his mother until his chest tightened, and then he remembered the white card that had been slipped beneath the door. The one he had read 3 times before falling asleep. The kitchen opens at 5 o'clock in the morning. Someone will be there making pancakes. That person doesn't talk, but pancakes don't need words. The digital clock on the nightstand read 4:52. Sam sat up, pulled on the thick, dry socks, and crept along the endless hallway down the stairs, one hand sliding over the wooden banister that was 3 times bigger than the railing in their old apartment building, thinking to himself that if his mother were here, she would say, "What kind of house makes you walk far enough from bed to kitchen to count as morning exercise?" The kitchen glowed with warm yellow light, and exactly as the card had promised, the man in the black shirt was standing at the stove, his sleeves rolled high, a cast-iron skillet in front of him, and what made Sam freeze in the doorway wasn't the fact that the most feared boss on the lakeshore knew how to cook, but that he did it with terrifying precision. The jar of flour, the eggs, and the pitcher of milk lined up straight as soldiers on parade, with a little stopwatch set beside the skillet. Dario heard his footsteps, turned, saw the boy with his hair sticking up in a borrowed pair of pajamas far too loose for him, and said nothing, only nodded once toward the high stool beside the kitchen island, a nod that meant sit, then turned back to the skillet. Sam climbed onto the stool, sat with his back straight out of habit, and for the first 10 minutes, the 2 of them exchanged nothing but the sound of butter hissing on hot cast iron, until the first pancake, perfectly round and evenly golden like something from an advertisement, was placed in front of him with a bottle of syrup, and Sam, both hungry and unable to hold back the curiosity he had inherited from his mother, blurted out, "Sir, why do you use a timer even when you make pancakes?" Dario stopped, looked at him for 1 second, then took a stack of white cards and a pen from his pocket, wrote a few words, and pushed the card across the stone countertop. "Because pancakes don't forgive guesswork." Sam read it, thought it over, then nodded with an air of understanding and said, "My mom says that about numbers too," before lowering his head and eating, and it really was good. So good that he ate 3 in a row, before suddenly remembering his manners and saying that Dario's pancakes were better than the ones from the corner shop back home, and the lady who owned that place had been making pancakes for 20 years. The second card slid across the counter. 20 years of doing it wrong is still doing it wrong. Sam burst out laughing and sprayed crumbs, then quickly covered his mouth with his hand, and he thought he saw the corner of the other man's mouth move by 1 millimeter. So fast he couldn't be sure it had really happened. Encouraged, the boy asked another question. "Then where did you learn to make pancakes, sir?" And the third card answered, "My grandmother's cookbook, page 41. She wrote a note saying the men in this family are allowed to ruin anything except breakfast." Sam giggled, and then suddenly the ache of missing his mother came rushing back without warning, the way it always did, and he looked down at his plate and went quiet for a while. And when he lifted his eyes again, he asked the question everyone in this mansion, everyone in this city, had spent 10 years avoiding, asking it directly the way only a child would dare. "Sir, why don't you talk?" The butter in the skillet gave a soft hiss. Dario stood still, his back still turned toward the stove, for so long that Sam thought he had asked a bad question, and he was about to apologize when the man turned off the burner, wiped his hands on a towel, sat down on the stool across from him, took out a card, and wrote, this time far more slowly than before, as if every word had to be weighed and considered before being allowed to exist. The card slid across the counter. "Because my words once ruined something important. My actions never have." Sam read it twice, his 9-year-old forehead wrinkling, and then he asked, "Is it like when I told the whole class I was a good swimmer, and then at the picnic I almost sank? So after that I didn't brag anymore, I just practiced swimming." The gray eyes looked at the boy for a very long time, and then Dario wrote the shortest card of the morning. "Yes, exactly like that." Sam nodded solemnly, as if the two of them had just signed a treaty, then announced that in that case he wouldn't make Dario talk, because his mother said forcing people to do things they didn't want to do was rude, but calling him Mr. Lombardi was too long, so he called him Uncle D, because D was the first letter of his name, and it was also the first letter on the envelope his grandfather had written. Dario's hand, gathering the cards, paused for half a beat, and Sam, too busy thinking about the letter, didn't see what passed through those gray eyes in that moment. He only saw the man nod, a slow, firm nod like a seal pressed into wax, and then write the final card of the morning and push it toward him. "Yes, on one condition. At 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, I teach you how to flip pancakes. Anyone who eats 3 in a row has to learn how to repay a debt." Sam grinned wide, held out his small hand to shake on the bargain, and the large hand that had once signed orders that made the underworld tremble took it as gently as if it were holding an egg, while upstairs, hidden behind the banister where she had been quietly watching all along, Carmela pressed a hand to her mouth, turned back toward her room, and for the first time in 10 years, allows herself to cry over something that wasn't sorrow. Though none of the three of them knew that only a few hours later, the mansion gate bell would ring, and the man standing outside the black iron gates this time would be holding up a police badge. The gate bell rang close to noon, and Ray Muller stood outside the black iron fence with his badge lifted toward the camera lens, the kind grandfatherly smile already in place. But this time that smile received exactly 30 seconds of silence before a voice came through the gate speaker, polite and firm, announcing that all requests to work with the mansion should be sent through the family law office. The phone number was on the brass plaque. "Have a good day, detective." And then the speaker cut off. The gate didn't move, and Muller stood there another minute beneath the lightly falling snow, looking at the silent gray house behind the line of pines, understanding that the initials DL in his notebook belonged to the kind of door a badge couldn't open, before he returned to his car with his half-smoked cigarette and a plan that would have to be rewritten from the beginning. While deep inside the grounds, Sam knew nothing about the visitor at the gate, because at that very moment he was in a far more interesting place, the East Garage, where Tommy Falco had taken him down to look around after promising at breakfast that this house had the most beautiful red vintage car in the state. The garage was as large as the gymnasium at school, gleaming and smelling of motor oil, with rows of black cars fitted with thick glass, and in the place of honor, beneath its own spotlight, stood a dark red vintage sports car that Tommy introduced in a reverent voice by saying it was older than Tommy himself, the car the boss's grandfather had left behind, and that no one in this house was allowed to touch it except the boss himself and an old mechanic who serviced it twice a year. And it was at that solemn moment that from the corner of the garage came a sound Sam would later describe as exactly like a cat stepping on a piano, a long, tearing metallic screech, then sudden silence, the kind of silence louder than the noise itself. Petey Malone, 19 years old, all long arms and legs as if he hadn't quite learned how to live inside his own body yet, stood frozen beside the red car with a jumper cable in his hand, his face white as paper, because he had just been sent to jump the battery on another car, and while clumsily dragging the cable across, the metal clamp had scraped a long line over the front wheel arch of the Treasure, leaving a deep scratch that exposed the metal beneath the original 60-year-old paint. The whole garage froze. Two mechanics standing nearby dropped their hands from what they were doing. The garage manager, Sal, a bald middle-aged man, slowly lifted one hand to his forehead like someone who had just witnessed an accident, and Tommy Falco, by reflex, set a hand on Sam's shoulder and drew the boy back toward the door, not because of danger, but because experience told him that what was about to happen wasn't meant for children, because the message had already been sent, and less than 4 minutes later, the door connecting the garage to the main house opened, and Dario Lombardi walked in. No one breathed. Petey stood at attention as if facing a firing squad, both hands pressed flat to his pant legs, his lips moving around an apology that wouldn't come out, and Sam, standing safely beside Tommy at the far end of the garage, watched the man who made him pancakes every morning walk slowly across the polished concrete floor, stop before the scratch, bend down and look at it for a very long time, then straighten and turn toward the trembling young man. Sam could feel his heart pounding, because he had heard Bettina whisper to the assistant cook that the boss was the most frightening man in Illinois, that someone had once betrayed a shipment and vanished from the city, and for 1 second, the boy was afraid he was about to see the man from those rumors. But what happened next was something no rumor had ever told. Dario took Petey's wrist, not squeezing, only guiding, and placed the boy's trembling hand flat on the hood of the car, keeping it there, bare palm against cold metal, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, until the shaking passed from the young man's hand into the body of the car and slowly faded, then disappeared, as if the old car had drawn all the boy's fear through its paint. Then the boss unbuttoned his shirt cuff, rolled it up, nodded toward the tool cabinet, and in the absolute astonishment of everyone in the garage, the most powerful man on the lakeshore knelt on one knee on the concrete beside the 19-year-old apprentice, laid out a tray of fine sandpaper, polishing compound, a work light, and began tending to the scratch, slowly, meticulously, now and then taking Petey's hand and placing it in the right position, adjusting the angle of the sandpaper, tapping 2 fingers lightly on the spot that needed wiping. An entire hour like that, without a word, with only the soft rasp of sandpaper, and the young man's breathing gradually evening out. And by the end of the hour it was no longer the boss repairing the car, but Petey, while the boss only sat beside him holding the light. When the scratch was nothing more than a faint trace visible, only if one tilted the head, Dario stood, brushed off the knee of his pants, washed his hands at the sink in the corner of the garage, then drew out his familiar stack of white cards, wrote for longer than usual, and handed one to Sal, and the manager read that card in front of everyone, and Sam saw his face change from tension to disbelief, then into something very much like shame. Only that evening, through Bettina's telling in the kitchen, did Sam learn what the card had said, that from today on the kid is my mechanic, schedule him to train with old Gino 3 times a week, and if from now on he ruins anything else in this garage, the first person who answers to me is you, because you let an untaught boy stand beside things he hadn't yet learned. That night, lying in the room with the fireplace, Sam wrote in the small notebook he had started keeping for his mother to read when she came home. The letters crooked but firm. Mom, today I found out people are all wrong about Uncle D, just like you said they were wrong about Grandpa. I think good people like this get lied about a lot, because they never argue back, and the boy closed the notebook and went to sleep. Not knowing that downstairs, in the brightly lit study, Tommy Falco had just placed a thin file on the boss's desk bearing the name Ray Muller. 27 years of service. And the first page alone was enough to make Dario's finger stop tapping on the tabletop. That night, after Sam had fallen sound asleep upstairs, and the study light still cast a yellow glow onto the snow beyond the window, Tommy Falco sat in the small parlor beside the fireplace with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, and Carmela, wrapped in her wool robe, lowered herself into the armchair across from him with the air of someone who had already made an important decision. Then said that Tommy, you've followed Dario for 10 years. You've been more loyal than a blood brother. And yet you've never known why he fell silent. And I don't think that's fair to you or to him, especially now that the Kane name has crossed the threshold of this house. You need to understand what you're protecting. So tonight I'll tell you. You listen and keep it buried. Consider it an old 78-year-old woman paying back 10 years of silence of her own. She looked into the fireplace for a long while and then began, her voice even and dry as the turning of paper, saying that it happened years ago, when Dario was still a young man, and you have to understand that the young Dario back then was an entirely different person. He was the one who talked the most in this house. Dear God, he talked from morning until night. He read books and then retold them to the whole dinner table. He trusted people so deeply that his father worried over it. He was the only one in this family who wanted to wash everything clean, who wanted to bring every dollar of the family's money into the light. And to do that, the families and the Chicago elite at the time built a joint charitable investment fund, a bridge between the old world and the new one. Money from the Lombardi house, from the other houses, from bank owners and society wives all poured into it, and the man who kept the books for the fund was an outside chief accountant, without faction, without family ties, chosen precisely because of his rare reputation for cleanliness, a thin man with glasses named Frank Kane. Tommy set his glass down. Carmela nodded, yes, the very grandfather of the boy sleeping upstairs, and she went on, saying that for several years that fund ran as smoothly as a Swiss watch until one autumn, when a routine audit discovered that $12 million had vanished through a chain of transactions approved under Frank Kane's signature, on documents written in Frank Kane's hand, transferred into accounts only Frank Kane had the authority to create. Every arrow pointed to one man, neatly, perfectly. And you know, Tommy, in our line of work, anything too perfect has been arranged, but back then no one wanted to look in that direction, because the Ruggiero family had stepped forward to lead the outrage. The fund's financial advisor, Carmine Ruggiero, wept over the stolen charity money in front of the press, demanding justice while all Chicago roared along with him, calling for the accountant to be hanged. But it was his cunning wife, Renata, who truly pulling the strings from the shadows, orchestrating the public theater, while her husband acted as her powerful front. She paused, her old knuckles tightening together, then her voice dropped lower, and that was when my nephew did the fateful thing of his life. You have to picture the scene, the annual gala in the hotel ballroom, 500 of the most powerful people in the city, family heads, bank owners, judges, and in the middle of that dinner, while the honorable advisor raised his glass and called on everyone to trust justice, 26-year-old Dario Lombardi stood up, brushed off his father's restraining hand, and said aloud before the entire ballroom that Frank Kane was innocent, that he had sat with Mr. Kane for 3 nights and reviewed every number, that the only person with access, motive, and opportunity was the advisor standing there with a wineglass in his hand. He pointed straight at him, Tommy, in front of 500 people, at the flower pinned to the chest of the most powerful man after the mayor, without a single sheet of proof in his hand. And what did that ballroom do? She laughed, a laugh with no joy in it at all. First there was silence, then someone chuckled, and then all 500 people burst out laughing, as if they were watching a comedy. People patted his father on the shoulder, and said they were sorry about his impulsive, precious son. And worse than the laughter, worse than all of it, was that the very next week, his defense of Frank Kane was twisted into the final nail. The newspapers wrote that even the son of the underworld had come forward to shield the accountant. So how deeply involved must that man be? And that was the end of it. Frank Kane wasn't just an embezzler anymore. He became an embezzler backed by the Mafia. He lost his job, lost his friends, lost everything. The case closed with a civil settlement that crushed him, and 1 year later, exactly 10 years ago as of this winter, he died in a house where nearly all the furniture had already been sold. While my nephew stood at the farthest corner of the cemetery on the day they lowered him into the ground, not daring to come closer, because he believed his own mouth had helped dig that grave. The fireplace gave a soft crackle. Carmela pulled her robe tighter around herself, and she finished the last part, saying that after he came home from that funeral, Dario stopped talking, not in 1 day or 2, but slowly, like a lamp burning out of oil. He had learned the cruelest lesson this city had to teach him. That truth without weight wasn't merely useless, it could kill. So he swore he would only open his mouth when his words were heavy enough that no one could laugh anymore. And for 10 years he has lived by that vow, gathering every sheet of paper, every bank statement, every witness. You thought the safe in the study held business secrets, didn't you? It doesn't, it holds a case, missing only one piece, the original piece, the real ledger in Frank Kane's real handwriting, to place beside those forged documents and strip the difference bare. For 10 years, he couldn't find it, because everyone said the ledger had burned, and then last week, Tommy, that final piece walked through the gates of this house on its own, inside the backpack of a 9-year-old child looking for his mother. Tommy Falco sat motionless for a long time, then asked the only question, his voice roughened. So the boy and his mother, the boss is saving them because of a debt to a dead man. And Carmela looked at him through the firelight, her black eyes sharp as knives and wet, and answered that he thinks so. He believes this is a debt, but I'm old now. I can see what he doesn't dare look at yet, and you just wait and see. A debt doesn't make a man get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to make pancakes. Then she rose and went to bed, leaving Tommy alone with the unfinished whiskey and the dying fire. And at that exact moment, the phone in his pocket buzzed, a message from the search team with only one line. Sir, the people holding Lydia Kane have just allowed her to make a phone call. The call came in at 10 o'clock at night, not to the mansion, but to the voicemail box of the accounting firm where Lydia worked. A pre-recorded voice message exactly 40 seconds long, played through a background voice changer. The kind Tommy's technical team managed to extract that very night, thanks to an acquaintance at the firm. And when that recording sounded through the study, for the first time in 5 days, Dario Lombardi heard the voice of the woman he was searching for, tired but strangely level, not trembling, not breaking, a voice that kept its back straight even in the dark. She said that she was Lydia Kane. She was still all right. She needed a few more days of leave because of family matters. Please let the team lead know that the files she had left unfinished should remain exactly as they were. No one should touch them. The balances of the reconciled accounts had been closed in the old order, 7/13/21, as they were every year, and please have someone water the plant on her desk. Thank you very much. That was all. Her captors must have approved every word, because the whole thing sounded like a bland office message, perfect proof of life, meant to reassure the accounting firm enough that it wouldn't call the police. But the next morning, when Tommy replayed the recording in the kitchen for Carmela to hear, in case there was any clue, Sam, who was eating pancakes at the kitchen island, suddenly stopped chewing, set down his fork, and said in the calm voice of a child announcing an obvious fact, "Mom's sending a warning. In her real ledger work, she completely avoids odd numbers because they make reconciliations sloppy. But 7/13/21 is the exact sequence from a secret game we've played since I was in 1st grade. She calls it the false balance sequence. Whenever she uses it, it means everything that follows is a hidden puzzle that must be decoded by reversing the pairs and subtracting my birthday. And there's definitely no plant on her desk, she always says. Plants are the natural enemies of clean paperwork." The whole kitchen went utterly still. Tommy slowly lowered the phone, and Sam, seeing the adults stare at him, went on explaining that 7/13/21 was a game he and his mother played. She called it the lying number sequence. And whenever she wrote him a note with that sequence at the beginning, it meant that whatever came after it had to be read by reversing the rule. For example, if she wrote no candy in the 3rd drawer, it meant there was candy in the 3rd drawer, and he was allowed to eat it. His mother had been playing that game with him since he was in first grade, and then the boy suddenly froze halfway through, his eyes widening, before he slipped down from the stool and ran upstairs. Returning a minute later with the leather-bound notebook, Dario had returned exactly as promised, flipping frantically to the final page, where there was a long string of numbers he had once thought was only boring grown-up accounting. And there, at the start of the sequence, 3 groups of numbers stood side by side like 3 centuries, 7, 13, 21. 10 minutes later, the notebook lay open on the study desk beneath 2 lamps. Dario and Tommy bent over the page, while Sam sat in a leather chair far too large for him, invited upstairs in the role Tommy solemnly called Chief Decoding Expert, and the young decoding expert proudly guided them through the steps, watching eagerly as Dario applied the cipher, reversed the pairs, and subtracted Sam's birthday, just as Lydia had always done during their games. Dario rewrote the number sequence according to the boy's instructions, his upright pen strokes moving across the paper, reversing, subtracting, joining, and when the final numbers took shape, Tommy shot up from his chair, because it wasn't a bank password as they had expected. It was a sequence made of a zip code on the city's west side, a street number, and a 4-digit number, like a rented safe deposit box number. A complete address pointing straight to a private depository branch located between Cicero and Berwyn, the kind of place that rented safe boxes without asking too many questions. And suddenly everything became as clear as a year-end balance sheet. Lydia Kane had copied the audit evidence on the Ruggiero Foundation, hidden it in an anonymous rented safe, encoded the address onto the final page of her father's notebook, then handed all of it to her son, the only person in the world who could solve it. And even while imprisoned, she had still found a way to send a signal through a censored voicemail message to activate the lying number sequence. That woman had stayed one move ahead of her captors, even from inside their own prison. Dario stood upright and issued 3 consecutive orders on 3 white cards. Sal's team goes tonight. Only 4 people know this address. You, Tommy, and the 2 drivers. The boy stays home. He absolutely does not leave the grounds. And when Sam pouted that he was the chief decoding expert, Dario wrote him a separate card saying that decoding experts never go into the field. They're too valuable. Ask any spy movie. And the boy had no choice but to nod and accept, on the condition that he be allowed to stay awake and wait for news. A condition that failed after exactly 20 minutes when he fell asleep on the study sofa, and Bettina carried him back to bed. But the news that returned from Cicero close to 2 o'clock in the morning was not the news anyone wanted to hear. Saul's voice over Tommy's phone tight as a drawn wire. Sir, we got in. The rental paperwork was valid. The spare key matched, but the safe was empty. No signs of forced entry. It was opened with the correct code and the correct key, and according to the building's electronic log, someone accessed this box at 11:40 tonight, less than 2 hours before we arrived, and the hallway cameras went black because of a power outage for exactly 15 minutes around that time. In the study, Tommy lowered the phone, and the 2 men looked at each other across the desk in a silence, unlike any silence of the past 10 years, because this calculation had only one answer. The safe's address had been decoded less than 6 hours earlier, had never existed on any paper except the card Dario had burned with his own hands after giving the order. Only 4 people knew. 4 people. And one of those 4, or one pair of ears very close to those 4, had sold it in the night. The enemy was no longer outside the black iron gates. The enemy was inside, walking across these carpets, eating at the same table, and perhaps even now, listening to the same phone call. The morning after the Cicero night, the lakeside mansion still operated as if nothing had ever happened. Pancakes were still flipped at 5 o'clock. Sam was still allowed by old Gino to go out to the garage and watch Petey learn the trade, and that absolute appearance of normalcy was Dario Lombardi's first move, because he understood a rule that 10 years of silence had taught him more thoroughly than anyone, that a mole only reveals himself when he believes no one is looking for him. So he questioned no one, changed no one's schedule, looked at no one a second longer than usual. He only sat in his study and began setting up a chessboard. On the walnut desk he wrote 4 cards, 4 versions of the same lie. The first version said that Frank Kane's original ledger had been moved to the records vault of the partner law firm downtown. The second said it was inside the safe of a private bank in Evanston under the name of a shell company. The third said it was still inside the mansion but would be transferred at noon on Thursday, by armored car to a location that would only be revealed once the vehicle was moving, and the fourth said it had been fully digitized and that the original would be burned to protect the witness. 4 stories, 4 cards, and each card was given to one single channel that did not intersect with the others. One to the family's legal team through a closed meeting led by Aldo Ferri. One to the household staff circle through instructions deliberately given where Bettina and 2 servants could hear. One to the outer security team through a vehicle movement plan distributed by Sal, and one to the organization's private accountant through the internal phone line. Then Dario sat down and waited, like a hunter, placing 4 traps on 4 trails, and knowing with certainty that the hungry animal would have to step into one of them. But he did not merely wait, because at the same time there was a second front to open, a front neither his grandfather nor his father had ever dared to imagine, and at noon that day, in a small family-style diner halfway down the avenue near St. Adalbert Church, a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair and a gray wool coat sat at the table farthest inside, where Tommy Falco had already been waiting with 2 cups of coffee. Special Agent Dana Whitlock of the FBI's Chicago office, who 11 years earlier had been a young agent on the federal investigative team that had briefly reviewed the charity fund case. The only person on that team who had written an internal note saying the file against Frank Kane was suspiciously clean, a note that had been shelved but that she had never withdrawn. And for 11 years she had kept the habit of opening that old file at the end of every year and reading it once, the way someone visits a grave. Tommy pushed an unsealed envelope across the table. There was no money inside, the kind of thing she would have thrown back at once. Inside was the unfinished analysis Lydia Kane had prepared on the Ruggiero Foundation's money flows, which Dario's team had recovered from the accounting firm's server, along with a white handwritten card in that upright script, saying that she had been right 11 years ago, that the woman who could prove it was being held somewhere on the west side of the city, that the woman's 9-year-old son was with them and safe, that they were not asking her to trust them, only asking her to trust the file. And Whitlock read for 10 minutes without saying a word, then looked up and asked only one question: "What do you want from me?" Tommy's answer fit into a single sentence: "Our speed and your law. Each side is missing what the other has." From that afternoon on, 2 machines ran side by side. The FBI's technical team quietly analyzed Lydia's voicemail recording, which the Lombardi side had handed over, separating out the background sounds ordinary ears would have missed. The freight train horns sounding twice at regular intervals, the sound of an airplane descending along the approach path to Midway Airport, and the deep hum characteristic of an industrial transformer station, 3 layers of sound overlapping to mark out a crescent-shaped zone on the edge of Cicero, where exactly 4 self-storage complexes were still operating, while at the lakeshore, the traps began to tremble. Wednesday passed quietly. No one looked into the law firm's records vault. The Evanston Bank had no strange inquiry, but by Thursday morning, the very day the 3rd version had scheduled the armored car transfer, Sal's people reported back 3 signs in quick succession: a truck with its license plate covered in mud, parked to block the line of sight at the only curve on the planned route, 2 strange men asking to rent the rooftop of a coffee shop overlooking the mansion's side gate, and an anonymous call to the partner bodyguard company pressing for the day's vehicle schedule. The fish had bitten the 3rd hook, the version that had been shared only in the closed meeting of the legal team. The circle of suspicion narrowed from 4 channels to 1 room, and in that room, the man seated at the head of the table was Aldo Ferri, the 60-year-old chief counsel who had served the Lombardi house since Dario's father's time, the man who had attended every baptism and every funeral in the family for 3 decades. But Dario did not allow himself to close a case on the strength of 1 hook, because there had been 3 other lawyers in that meeting room, 2 assistants, and any one of them could have been the ear that sold the information, and even Aldo himself might only have accidentally let it slip through a channel he had not suspected. 50%, Dario wrote on the card beside his cold cup of coffee, and underlined the words "not enough," because the lesson of 11 years ago had been carved into his bones that accusing a human being before the weight in your hand is heavy enough is the surest way to harm both that person and yourself. Thursday night, in the study with the curtains drawn tight, the final plan was settled on the desk between Dario, Tommy, and Whitlock, who had arrived in a civilian car through the rear gate. The FBI had narrowed the most suspicious storage complex within the Crescent Zone by cross-checking rental records against shell companies. A search warrant was being reviewed by a federal judge and would be signed before dawn. Her tactical team would coordinate with Dario's people on the outer perimeter. No one would fire unless fired upon first. Every person taken into custody had to stay alive to stand trial. That was Whitlock's condition, and Dario accepted it with a nod that did not hesitate. Then, when every map had been folded and Whitlock had left, Tommy looked at his boss standing by the window, staring out at the black surface of the lake, and asked softly, "What about the mole, sir? Are we just leaving him in the house while we go rescue her?" And Dario wrote the final card of a long day and pushed it across the desk. On it were only 2 sentences. "Leave it exactly where it is. A marked ear is more useful than a severed one, and tomorrow, when we bring her home, it will have to report that news to its master." At 4:15 in the morning, the search warrant was signed, and at 4:50, while the eastern sky had not yet begun to change color, 2 convoys without lights rolled into the self-storage complex on the edge of Cicero from opposite directions, smooth as water flowing into low ground. The FBI tactical vehicles took the lead exactly as agreed, while Sal's men spread out to seal the 3 rear exits and both ends of the alley running along the railroad tracks. No sirens, no headlights, only white breath in the cold air and the sound of snow compressing beneath boot soles. Whitlock stood beside the command vehicle, an earpiece in one ear, checking the complex's electrical layout one last time against the thermal record from the high-altitude drone that had been circling for the past 2 hours. 3 human heat signatures in the management building, 1 solitary heat signature, unmoving, inside the converted unit in the northwest corner, the only unit with a new ventilation pipe and a separate electrical line. She raised 3 fingers, folded them down one by one, and the world opened in exactly 90 seconds. The magnetic lock on the main gate was disabled. The door of the management building flew open with the shouted command of federal agents, face down on the floor. The night guard who had been dozing did not reach his phone before he was cuffed neatly to the chair. The other 2 men in the camera room were forced down onto the carpet among empty energy drink cans. One man managed to run 3 steps toward the back door before meeting the wall named Sal, and deciding very quickly that lying down was the wiser choice. Not 1 shot, not 1 drop of blood, only the tightening snap of plastic restraints around wrists and the steady recitation of the right to remain silent, even as a prayer. And in everyone's earpiece came Whitlock's voice, dry and clipped, area secure, open the northwest unit. They cut the storage unit lock with hydraulic cutters. The metal roll-up door slid aside, and behind the second soundproof door, beneath the ceiling bulb that never turned off, Lydia Kane was standing in the middle of the room, not curled in a corner, not lying on the folding cot, but standing, back straight, hair tied neatly, bare feet planted on the cold floor, both hands resting at her sides like someone opening the door to receive guests, defiant despite her days of captivity. Because she had heard the unfamiliar sounds 3 minutes earlier, and had decided that whatever came through that door, it would not see her afraid. A tall man in a black coat with no badge, walking behind 2 armored agents, and when the 2 agents moved to either side to clear the room, that man stopped 3 steps away from her, did not come any closer, did not offer his hand, did not say a word, only looked at her with gray eyes the color of a January lake, and Lydia, who had prepared herself for police, for kidnappers, for anyone at all, looked at that silent stranger and asked the only question left inside her after 6 days. Her voice hoarse but unbroken, "Where is my son?" Dario offered no verbal reply. Instead, he reached calmly into his coat pocket, making her tense on instinct only to pull out his phone. He tapped the screen twice, waited, then turned the screen toward her, and on that bright screen, in some warm yellow kitchen far away in a place she did not know, her son was sitting on a high stool beside an old woman with white hair, his cheeks puffed full of pancakes, waving his fork as he explained something terribly important, and the boy's voice spilled through the phone speaker into the prison room, clear and chattering, "Aunt Carmela. Did you know pancakes don't forgive guesswork? Uncle D taught me that. This morning I flipped 2 all by myself, and didn't tear either one. When my mom comes home, she's definitely going to say I'm bragging." Lydia Kane managed to remain standing very straight for exactly 3 more seconds. She had not cried when the gray sedan forced her to the curb in the dark, had not cried before the ceiling, speaker, and the distorted voice, had not cried through the endless days beneath the light bulb that never went off. Tears were something she had given up at 18, the way people give up a luxurious habit, but no lesson, no counting to 3, could prepare a mother for the sight of her child, safe, full, cheeks stuffed with pancakes and boasting about his skill at flipping them. Her knees gave out, and she sank down right in the middle of the prison room floor, both hands clutching the phone as if she were holding a face, and she cried the cry of 6 days, of 6 years, perhaps of all 11 years gathered together, her shoulders shaking in waves she could not stop, while on the screen the boy kept talking, unaware of everything, because on the other end, Carmela had carefully kept the camera in one-way mode, transmitting only and receiving nothing, exactly as her nephew's card had instructed beforehand, so the child would not have to see his mother in this room, would not have to see the ceiling bulb, would never have to know this room existed. The man in the black coat stood still through all of that crying, did not rush her, did not place a hand on her shoulder, did not take back the phone. He only removed his coat, draped it gently over the trembling shoulders of the woman sitting on the floor, then stepped 3 paces back and turned his face away, looking at the blank wall, as if her tears were something so private that a stranger had no right to witness them. And Whitlock, standing in the doorway and watching it all, would later write in her report one dry line, saying that the victim was recovered in stable condition, but she would never write down anywhere the thing she saw most clearly that morning, that the man all of Chicago called the cruelest man in Illinois had stood facing the wall of a prison room, both hands clenched behind his back, as if it took every ounce of strength he possessed to keep himself standing right where he was, while the car carrying Lydia Kane left Cicero just as dawn broke, driving east toward the lake, toward the child flipping his 3rd pancake without knowing that his mother was on her way home. The black car rolled through the iron gates just as the sun lifted above the lake, and the news moved through the mansion faster than any text message. People came down to the grand hall without anyone telling them to, Bettina still wearing her flour-stained apron, Sal and 2 mechanics from the garage, Petey Malone tucked behind old Gino's back. Even the guards who had been trained never to leave their posts found reasons to stand near the doorways, because for the past 6 days this whole house had been living to the rhythm of a search no one had named aloud, and now everyone wanted to see with their own eyes that it was over. While at the foot of the stairs, Carmela held Sam by the shoulders, the boy newly awakened and told only one sentence, that someone wanted to see him in the hall. He was still wearing the borrowed pajamas that hung loose on him, his hair sticking up, rubbing his eyes. And then the double doors opened. The cold morning air swept in with a woman visibly thinned down inside an oversized man's coat, her hair tied neatly back, her steps a little unsteady after 6 days without seeing the sun, and for 1 second, the whole grand hall heard the sound of a child forgetting how to breathe. Mom. The call broke in half at the center, and Sam tore free from Carmela's hands, raced barefoot across the marble floor, and threw himself straight into the arms already giving way to receive him. And Lydia Kane held her son so tightly, it was as if she needed to prove through flesh and bone that he was real, her hand running through his hair, her palm pressing to his cheek, his shoulder, his back, her mouth repeating over and over, without forming whole sentences, that she was here. She was here now. She was sorry. She was home. While Sam buried his face in his mother's neck and chattered through tears that he had done everything right, Mom. He didn't call the police. He remembered the rules. He kept the notebook, he found the right door, and that very sentence, that pitiful childlike pride, made men who had lived their whole lives by the laws of the underworld look down at their shoes. Bettina cried into her apron. Old Gino took off his glasses and wiped them with the hem of his shirt. The entire grand hall of the most feared family, on the lakeshore, stood as still as a church, and on the stair landing, Dario Lombardi watched the reunion below for exactly 3 breaths, then turned and went back upstairs midway through it without a sound. Only Carmela watched her nephew's back disappear into the hallway, and she said softly, almost to herself but loud enough for Tommy beside her to hear, "Don't blame him. 10 years ago there was almost a reunion like this too. A father coming home to his daughter, and it didn't happen, because my nephew spoke and no one believed him. He can't bear this scene. He can only bear being the one who creates it." They prepared a room for Lydia beside Sam's room, The family doctor came to examine her and confirmed that she was only exhausted and sleep-deprived. And for the first 2 days, she hardly moved half a step away from her son, sleeping with his hand in hers, waking to listen to him talk. And through his bright, chattering stories, this new world slowly took shape before her, in a way that chilled her blood piece by piece. Uncle D taught me how to flip pancakes. Uncle D has a red vintage car. Uncle Tommy says all Chicago is scared of Uncle D, but I don't think he's scary at all. And Lydia sat in the room with the fireplace already burning, looked around at the fine wood walls, the discreet cameras in the hallway corners, the broad-shouldered men changing shifts outside the grounds, and understood where she was. She was in the Lombardi house, the name the whole city lowered its voice to speak. She was the daughter of Frank Kane, the man this very underworld had helped grind into dust, and her son was calling the boss of that world Uncle D with a light in his eyes the boy had never given to any man. The terror came late, but it came fully, and on the 3rd day, she told Sam to stay in the room with Bettina, went down to the study herself, knocked on the door, stood with her back straight before the desk of the man who had saved her, and said in the voice of a handover meeting that she was grateful for what he had done, that she would find a way to repay him, every dollar, no matter how many years it took. But her son and she could not stay here. She knew what this house was, Mr. Lombardi, and she had lost all her youth learning one lesson, that when your world touches anyone, that person's life shatters, and she would not let her son grow up worshipping a crime lord. So please return her father's notebook. They would leave today. Dario listened to all of it, not a single muscle in his face moving. Then he took out his stack of white cards, wrote longer than usual, and pushed across the desk the card she would read again and again during the nights that followed. The doors of this house aren't locked against you. They never have been. If you want to leave, a car will take you within the hour. But the person who took you hasn't been arrested. That person knows what you saw in their books and knows your son held the ledger. And the doors outside this house refused the boy 12 times when he needed help. Stay not because of me, not out of gratitude, but because of your son, until that person is in prison. No one in this house needs anything from you, not even a thank you. Lydia read the card twice, and what she hated most was that every word on it was true in the cold, unarguable way numbers were true. She folded the card and said that in that case, they would stay until that person was arrested, not 1 day longer. Then she turned toward the door and stopped for 1 second, when the only voice she carried with her from that room was not a voice at all, but the sound of the pen being set down on the desk behind her, so soft it was almost a sigh. And that evening, when Sam excitedly invited his mother to come down to the kitchen at 5 o'clock the next morning to watch him flip pancakes with Uncle D, Lydia stroked his hair and said gently, but in a tone that left no room for argument, that from tomorrow on, he would eat breakfast with her in their room. They wouldn't trouble the owner of the house anymore. Did he understand? Sam's eyes fell, his fingers tightening around the edge of his drawing paper. But Mom, Uncle D didn't mix the batter wrong today, and he promised to show me how to flip the big ones. Lydia felt a sharp pang of guilt in her chest, knowing she was weaponizing her own fear against her son's innocent joy, but she kept her posture rigid, gently lifting his chin. I know, sweetheart, but we are guests, and we have troubled Mr. Lombardi enough. We must keep our books clean. The 9-year-old boy looked into his mother's tired, resolute face. He didn't fully understand the heavy adult boundaries shifting around them, but his mother had just crossed a dark ocean to get back to him, so he swallowed his disappointment and gave a small, quiet nod. What neither he, nor his mother, nor the man who sat alone in the study that night, with a half-written card he later crushed in his fist, knew was that on the other side of the city, the person who had just lost a hostage was being informed of the raid, and that person's first question was not how many men had been lost, but a question that made even the messenger shiver. What about the ledger? Whose house is the ledger in? 1 day became 3 days, 3 days became 2 weeks, because the mastermind was not arrested as quickly as Lydia had imagined. The men cuffed in Cicero turned out to be hired muscle who had taken the job through 3 layers of intermediaries, and after they confessed as far as the 2nd layer, every trace dissolved into shell companies. Whitlock needed time, and so mother and son stayed in a condition Lydia described to herself as temporary lodgers. She made herself a set of rules and kept them the way she kept books, not eating at the same table with the owner of the house, accepting nothing beyond a room and meals, writing down every expense so she could repay it later, and absolutely not allowing herself to get used to this place. But this place had its own way of slipping inside a person. It did not slip in through words. It slipped in through things already done before she had time to refuse them. The fireplace in her room was always lit before she woke, at exactly the right temperature, never too warm. Winter shoes in her size appeared beside the door. On the very day she had meant to borrow Bettina's old boots so she could go outside with Sam, and one morning, on the small table in the reading room where she often sat, someone had neatly placed a stack of carefully bound files, no letter attached, no card, only paper labels marked by year and month, and when she opened them, her heart stopped for a beat. They were the case files on her father, more complete than anything she had managed to gather in 11 years. Copies of court records, newspaper articles, trace results on the ghost accounts that had once received the money. Documents that an 18-year-old daughter back then had neither the right nor the money to touch, all arranged in chronological order, as if the person who organized them wanted to say that she had a right to know. She read for 3 nights straight, cried alone twice, but in the morning still came downstairs with a level face, because she was still waiting for the thing that 11 years of experience had taught her would certainly come, the price. No one lit a fireplace for a stranger without wanting something. No one fed a nameless mother and child in his house without keeping an account. She had met enough kinds of kindness with invoices attached. The invoice would come sooner or later, and the fact that it still had not come made her more wary, not more reassured. Then her auditor's eye, that professional reflex that could not be turned off, began automatically doing what it did with everything in the world, reconciling. One late afternoon in the kitchen, Bettina asked her to look over a letter from a vocational school for her nephew, proudly saying the boy had received a full scholarship for 3 years now, from some fund called the Open Door Initiative, and more than 10 children in Pilsen had received it too, and Lydia, purely out of professional curiosity, noticed that the fund logo printed on the paper had no address, only a post office box. A few days later, while helping old Gino reorganize the garage filing cabinet, she saw that name again briefly on the tuition folder for P.D. Malone's technical school, the same fund, the same post office box, and that night, an old memory rose from the bottom of her mind and made her sit bolt upright in bed. Some time ago, during a harsh winter when she had been sick for so long that she had nearly lost her job and the rent had piled up, a fund for single mothers had found its way to the accounting firm through Human Resources, providing a lifeline of assistance with no repayment required. She had filled out the application in tears and told herself there were still good people in the world. What was that fund called? She had to search her wallet for the old card she had kept like a lucky charm, and under the bedside lamp, the small line of text appeared, the Open Door program for single-parent families. She sat still for a very long time, then did the thing she was best at in the world. She traced it the way she traced a money flow. It took 4 days, borrowing the town library computer when she took Sam to exchange books, using public business lookup portals, and every road led back to the same place. The Open Door Initiative, the Open Door program, the scholarships in Pilsen, the assistance through her firm, even the free breakfast funding package at Sam's own elementary school that she had once signed papers agreeing for him to receive. All of them were different names for the same anonymous trust registered in Delaware, funded by a single entity whose trustee identity was hidden behind 3 layers of legal persons. But the outermost layer, the one only a stubborn auditor would dig down to, carried a name that made her hand go ice cold on the keyboard, a property management company whose registered address matched the law office of the Lombardi family. She sat in the town library among the children's bookshelves, looking at the screen, and felt the ground beneath all her laws crack open, because this calculation would not balance. That man had been paying for her son's breakfasts for 3 years. He had helped lift her through the hardest year of her life without her ever knowing. He had been standing somewhere behind the lives of her and her son, long before the morning Sam rang the bell at the black iron gate, and a stranger did not do that. A stranger could not do that. That evening she returned to the mansion, past the lit study, slowed before the half-closed door. The question why already assembled in her mind, with all its supporting documents attached like an interrogation memorandum. But then she looked at her hand resting on the doorknob and drew it back, because she suddenly understood the thing that frightened her. She was not afraid that the answer would have a price. She had been paying prices all her life. She knew how to pay a price. What frightened her so badly she could not sleep was the remaining possibility that all of this had no price at all, because a kindness with a cost was something she could still understand. But a kindness that had lasted 3 years in the dark, with no invoice, no witness, not even a single thank you, demanded from her something more expensive than any debt. It demanded that she reconsider everything she believed about this world, and Lydia Kane stood in the dark hallway, her back still straight, asking herself for the first time in 11 years a question that did not belong on any balance sheet: who, in the end, was this silent man in her life, and when had he begun? Surrender began, as all great surrenders do, with something very small. 3 nights after the night, Lydia had stood outside the study door, and then retreated. She couldn't sleep. The kind of sleeplessness that comes when there are too many calculations in your head that refuse to balance. And near 5 o'clock in the morning, when she heard her son's footsteps creeping past her door, she pulled on a sweater and followed him, intending to drag the boy back to bed. She had forbidden him from going down to the kitchen for 2 weeks now, and he had obeyed with such drooping sadness that it made her feel guilty. But tonight he was clearly breaking the rule. She followed the warm yellow light down the stairs, stopped at the kitchen doorway, and the scene before her dissolved the scolding she had prepared. Her son was standing on a stool beside the stove, his tongue poking out to one side in concentration, a spatula in his hand, while the most powerful man on the lakeshore stood just behind him, both hands clasped behind his back exactly like a teacher supervising an exam. And when the pancake flipped over slightly crooked but whole, the crime lord gave a solemn nod as if approving troops on parade. Sam turned and saw his mother, his face falling as he waited to be scolded, and Lydia heard herself say a sentence she had not prepared at all. "Lower your elbow and the pancake will come out rounder, sweetheart." From that morning on, without any formal agreement, there were 3 people in the kitchen at 5 o'clock. Lydia told herself she came down only to watch her son, then told herself she came down because she wasn't sleeping anyway, then stopped telling herself anything at all, and that strange ritual took shape. Sam flipped pancakes and talked about everything in the world. Dario made coffee and listened. Lydia sat at the kitchen island with a cup of tea, at first only observing the way an auditor observes a process, and it was that professional eye that betrayed her, because by the 4th morning, she couldn't hold back anymore, and said he was over-mixing the batter. Pancake batter should still have lumps in it. If you beat it smooth like that, the pancakes would turn tough. Her family's recipe had done it that way for 3 generations. The whole kitchen went silent. Sam stared wide-eyed at his mother for daring to criticize Uncle D. Bettina, who had just stepped into the doorway, quickly turned around and pretended she had forgotten something, while Dario Lombardi set down the whisk, looked at the woman who had dared to criticize his batter, then pulled out a card, wrote, and pushed it across the stone counter. The card slid across the counter with a quiet challenge. "An auditor expects absolute compliance, but my kitchen operates on an established ledger that has never faced a deficit." Lydia lifted an eyebrow as she read it, then replied in the same voice she used to reject a flawed report. "Then your grandmother was wrong on page 41, and tomorrow morning I'll tell you where she was, right after you try mixing it my way." The result was that the next morning there were 2 bowls of batter, one smooth and one lumpy, and the 9-year-old judge tasted them blindfolded with absolute seriousness. And when Sam pointed to his mother's batch, Dario Lombardi stood still and looked at the 2 plates for a long time, then wrote a card and handed it to Lydia without looking at her. "Defeated. The undefeated streak has officially ended. I suppose custom must occasionally yield to superior taste." She laughed out loud, the first real laugh since that Friday night, and she did not see it, but Carmela, looking down from the stair landing, did see that the man by the stove had turned fully away to hide his face in the task of rinsing the skillet longer than necessary. From then on, the cards changed their tone, still spare with words as always, but something began to glimmer underneath them. She told a story about an old boss at the accounting firm who signed reports without reading them, and the card replied, "A man who signs without reading is more dangerous than a man who reads without signing." She asked whether he wasn't afraid she would write a memoir exposing the Lombardi family's bad pancake batter. And the card replied, "Afraid, which is why I am considering buying the rights in advance." And one morning, while Sam was busy drawing at the corner of the table, and snow was falling thickly beyond the glass, Lydia said without beginning or ending, half to her teacup, that her father used to wake at this hour too. He said numbers were most honest at 5 o'clock in the morning, because no one in the day had had time to dress them up yet. She did not wait for a reply, because it wasn't a question, but a little while later, a card was placed beside her teacup, so softly it made no sound. "I know. He said that to me once." She looked up sharply, but the man who had written it had already turned back to the skillet, his back straight, unreachable, and she understood that the door had opened only that far. Today it would open only that far. Then came the morning. She would later mark in memory the way she marked an important line in a ledger. Sam was delivering a speech about how when he grew up, he would be a mechanic like Petey, or an auditor like his mother, or preferably both. And the boy innocently asked Uncle D, "Do you have any rules, like a number 1 rule?" Daria wrote quickly, "Rule number 1, don't trust words, trust actions." Sam nodded with an air of deep understanding, then added with the unbearable logic of a 9-year-old, "So are my mom and me words or actions." The pen in the man's hand stopped. It stopped for a long time, so long that Sam had already moved on to another topic ages before, while Lydia suddenly found herself sitting very still, her heartbeat lodged somewhere in her throat. And at last, when Dario wrote, he wrote more slowly than any card she had ever seen, weighing every stroke as if letters truly had weight. Then he picked up the card, looked at it, nearly put it away, nearly stopped, before setting it down on the stone counter and pushing it over, not toward Sam, but toward her. "I have exceptions. They're more troublesome than rules, but I hear they're worth it." Lydia read that card twice, not daring to lift her eyes. Outside, the snow was still falling. In the kitchen, Sam was still chattering. The skillet was still hissing softly. Everything was exactly as it had been 1 minute before, and nothing was the same as it had been 1 minute before. That evening, in her room, she opened the vanity drawer to put away a hair clip and then froze, because at the bottom of the drawer, arranged as neatly as a stack of documents, were all the cards he had ever written to her. The one criticizing the batter, the one surrendering, page 41, the one about buying the memoir rights, the one about her father. She had kept every one of them, but since when? By what mechanism that she herself had never approved? She could not explain. The best auditor in the office could not explain the spending habits of her own heart. All she knew was that she picked up the newest card, the one about exceptions, placed it neatly on top, closed the drawer, and sat before the mirror for a very long time in the dark, reminding herself in her sternest voice that Lydia Kane, "You're only staying here until that person is arrested." And for the first time, she clearly heard that she did not believe herself. The next afternoon, while Sam followed old Gino and Petey out to the garage to learn how to tell different wrenches apart, Carmela summoned Lydia to the small second-floor parlor, with the excuse that she needed help reading some pension papers. But when Lydia walked in, the old woman was already sitting beside the fireplace with 2 full cups of tea and not a single paper in sight. She pointed to the chair across from her, waited until Lydia sat down, looked at her for a long while with those ageless black eyes, and then said that she should sit steady, because Carmela was about to do something her nephew had forbidden the entire house to do. She had promised him silence, but she was 78 years old now. She had watched him pay for a full 10 years, and she had the right to break one promise before she died, because she would rather have him angry with her than watch Lydia live in this house, without understanding what she was living among. Carmela set down her teacup, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You have read the files in the reading room, Lydia, so you already know the cold facts of how the city turned its back on your father, and how my nephew's desperate defense of him was twisted into a weapon. But dry ink on paper cannot capture the true weight of a man's penance. When Frank passed away, Dario stood at the edge of that lonely cemetery, utterly broken, believing his own young mouth had dug your father's grave. That is why he locked his voice away, child. His 10 years of absolute silence wasn't a choice. It was a self-inflicted prison sentence, a vow never to speak again until his words carried enough crushing weight to clear a debt he thought he owed to a ghost. Lydia could hear the rush of blood in her ears, and the numbers began automatically lining themselves up in her mind the way they always did, the stack of files arranged in chronological order, the 3-year-old anonymous fund, the shoes in exactly her size, the fireplace lit at exactly the right hour, and Carmela, as if she could read the addition taking place across Lydia's face, nodded and gave her the last number. Have you ever wondered why your father's notebook had this house's address in it? The other 12 addresses were old co-workers, old classmates, people your father had helped, all doors he hoped might still have some mercy left in them. But the 13th address was different. Dario told me that ink was older than the pages after it, which means your father wrote it before he died. He wrote down the address of a 26-year-old boy who had once stood up for him, along with the words the last one, the only one who ever believed. Do you understand now? That door was never an accident, child. Your father chose it for you and your son 10 years ago, with the last faith left in his life. Lydia covered her face with both hands, not crying, only breathing, and in the darkness behind her hands, every piece of this winter fell into place with a cold, ringing sound. She understood everything now, understood the first way he had looked at the notebook, understood why the gate had opened for a strange child, understood the 3-year fund and the stack of files and every wordless kindness in this house. All of it was a debt, an enormous debt to a dead man paid in installments through the dark for a decade to heirs who had never known. And the cruelest thing, the thing that made her grip the edge of the chair, was that she recognized that truth at the exact moment her heart, that stubborn auditor's heart she had closed off since she was 20, had just admitted an entry it had been hiding from her for weeks, that she had fallen in love with the silent man, fallen in love through the cards, through the gray hour of 5 o'clock in the morning, through the way he held her son's hand as gently as if he were holding an egg. She loved him, and in that same second she knew what she was to him. She was the final line in a debt schedule, an obligation to the man beneath the ground. Every fireplace lit for her had truly been lit for her father, and perhaps even the exception card she cherished at the top of her drawer was only the signature of a man paying the last interest due. Carmela watched the young woman sit up straight and dry eyes that were not wet, and she meant to say something more, the same thing she had once told Tommy beside the fireplace, that no debt makes a man get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to make pancakes. But Lydia had already stood, thanked her in a voice so perfectly calm it sounded like a closing meeting, saying that she was grateful Carmela had told her, that now all the numbers balanced, and then she excused herself and went back to her room, walking down the hallway with her back straighter than it had been since the day she arrived, because pride is the last asset of someone who has lost everything. She had already decided, neatly, like closing an accounting period, that she would stay until the person behind it all was arrested, that she would repay Dario every dollar she had received, including the 3 years of the anonymous fund, and then she would take her son out of this house and go far away. Before he could realize the debt had been paid in full, and before she could do the stupidest thing of her life and let him know she wanted to stay. But as she passed the study that night, she did not know that on the other side of the city, in a penthouse overlooking Michigan Avenue, a platinum-haired woman had just placed on the table a secretly taken photograph of the 3 of them in the brightly lit kitchen, and smiled. The woman in the penthouse overlooking Michigan Avenue was named Renata Ruggiero, 56 years old, widow of the greatest philanthropic tycoon Chicago had ever mourned, chairwoman of the foundation bearing her husband's name, honored guest at every gala in the city worth attending, and in the past 20 years, no one had ever seen her lose her composure, not even now, as she stood beside the window with a glass of white wine, listening to the man standing meekly on the carpet report the entire failure, the hired men swept up in Cicero, the hostage taken away right under their noses, and worst of all, the ledger the entire Ruggiero family had believed was ash 11 years ago turned out to still exist, hidden behind the walls of the Lombardi mansion. She listened to everything, did not interrupt, only swirled the wine gently in her glass, then said in that silk-smooth voice the people who worked for her feared, more than any shout, that they kept fussing with locks and guns. Men were truly predictable. There were doors that didn't need to be broken down, only made into doors the whole city demanded, be opened on one's behalf, prepare the car. Tomorrow morning I have breakfast with a few old friends. Those old friends, as it turned out, were scattered through newsrooms, aldermen's offices, charity boards, and the opening blow appeared 3 days later, on a local investigative news site hungry for scandal. A long article built on concerned anonymous sources, asking why a single mother accountant had vanished from her firm for weeks, and then reappeared under unclear leave circumstances, why her 9-year-old son had disappeared from school in the middle of the academic year, and why sources claimed both mother and child were now living behind the iron gates of the man the article, with perfectly evasive legal language, called the most controversial businessman on the lakeshore. The headline accused no one, yet it was crafted so neatly that readers did the accusing for it. The crime lord and the single mother, the child behind the iron gate. And within 24 hours, other news sites picked it up, added their own embroidery, and a secretly taken photograph from a long-range lens showing Sam playing in the snow in the yard with Petey was published with a poisonous caption, "The child seen inside a property guarded by armed security personnel." And just like that, without a single direct accusation, without one named source, without one fingerprint, the truth was bent 90 degrees by the very details that were real. While Renata Ruggiero read every article each morning over tea, pleased as a conductor hearing the orchestra play the score she had written. Then the machinery of procedure began its work, exactly as she had calculated. Detective Ray Muller, with 27 years of service and a spotless official record, formally opened a file to verify the safety of the minor Sam Kane, based on information reflected in the press, a completely proper procedural step that no superior could reject. And from that file, a letter bearing the seal of the Department of Children and Family Services was sent to the Lake Forest mansion, informing them that the agency had received a report concerning the child's current living environment, requesting cooperation from the guardian in providing information, and noting that if verification showed the environment to be unsuitable, measures including temporary guardianship could be considered. Lydia read that letter 3 times in the reading room, and by the 3rd time, the paper was trembling in her hand, not because she didn't understand, but because she understood too well. She made her living reading documents. She knew how frightening a lawful paper could be when used for the wrong purpose. They didn't need to kidnap her son again. They were asking the whole system to do it for them, legally, in broad daylight, with signatures and seals, and that night she sat beside her sleeping son until morning, watching his chest rise and fall, imagining him being led by strangers out through the gate in front of reporters' cameras, and for the first time since the prison room in Cicero, Lydia Kane felt so afraid she was nauseous. The 3rd blow struck where no one expected it. Carmela received a thick letter from the Children's Charity Society she herself had co-founded 30 years earlier. The wording sweet as jam, saying that in light of the current media environment, the organizers very regretfully had to adjust the Winter Gala guest list in order to protect the foundation's image, and they hoped she would understand. The old woman finished reading it, folded the letter along its original crease, set it on the table, and said to Tommy in a frighteningly calm voice that 30 years she had held in her arms the children of half the people on that guest list when they were still red-faced newborns. And now they crossed out her name to save a seat for that woman. Fine then, write this down for me. I am old, but I am not senile, and I have a very long memory. And at the center of that spiderweb, Renata Ruggiero sat reviewing invitations for her foundation's annual gala at the Drake Hotel, the largest event of the season, where she would stand under the lights and announce a new child protection initiative before 500 powerful figures and the entire press corps. She knew the Lombardi house had the ledger, knew it was deadly dangerous, but she also knew something even more certain, something all of Chicago knew, that papers did not know how to speak for themselves. Papers needed a human being to stand before the crowd and speak for them, and the only human being who could do that was the man who had not managed to utter one complete sentence in public in 10 years, the man who had once stood up and been crushed into silence. A wound like that did not heal. She believed that with her entire career, so she placed the whole game, her reputation, her foundation, her freedom, on the single wager she considered the safest bet in America, the silence of Dario Lombardi. She sealed the final invitation, smiled at herself in the window glass, and did not know that at that same hour, on the northern lakeshore, in the study with the curtains drawn tight, the silent man was placing 2 objects on the desk, Frank Kane's ledger and an invitation embossed in gold, bearing the name of the Ruggiero Foundation. quietly passed along by someone in high society who owed the Lombardi house a favor, and he looked at those two objects lying side by side for a very long time, like a chess player looking at a position he had foreseen 10 years before. After the letter from the Department of Children and Family Services, Lydia couldn't sleep anymore, and a woman like her, when she couldn't sleep, did not lie there counting the ceiling. She worked. She asked Dario's permission through a card left on the kitchen table, saying, "Give me access to every file in your safe, not so I can read them as a daughter anymore, but so I can review them as an auditor. If they're using procedure to strike at us, then I'll find something in the paperwork to strike back with." And the answer came that very evening, not as a card, but as the study door left open, the steel safe left open, the second desk lamp already turned on, and a second chair added behind the walnut desk. So in the nights that followed after Sam had gone to sleep, the two of them sat at opposite ends of the desk amid 11 years of papers, he reading and sorting, she reviewing and taking notes, neither of them speaking to the other, with only the sound of pages turning and the scratch of her pencil drawing perfectly straight lines, until the fourth night, the night everything broke open. That night Lydia did what she had meant to do from the beginning. She placed her father's original ledger beside the set of forged documents from 11 years ago. The statements Dario's team had bought back from the liquidation files of the insurance company, so she could compare two handwritings that were supposed to belong to the same man. And just as she had known since she was 18, they were frighteningly similar. The forger was a master, every hook, every slant, but an auditor does not look at beauty. An auditor looks at habits, and her father had one habit only someone who had lived with him would know. He wrote the number 7 with a crossbar through the middle in the old accounting style, while the forger, across 200 pages of documents, had written exactly 96 sevens with a crossbar, perfect ones except for 3. 3 naked 7s without a crossbar, slipped into hastily written lines at the bottoms of pages. 3 times in 200 pages, the forger had allowed the true habit of their own hand to rise to the surface. Lydia circled those 3 numbers, her heart pounding hard, then pulled out the cardboard box she had brought from the accounting firm, the work papers from the Ruggiero Foundation review, that she had copied before that fateful Friday night, including a stack of handwritten thank you letters to donors that the foundation circulated every year as an old-fashioned gesture of elegance, letters she had once picked up during the audit out of curiosity, and she remembered clearly with the photographic memory of someone who lived by data, that those letters had not been written by a secretary. They had been written by the chairwoman herself. The press had praised that very thing. 500 letters every holiday season in the hand of the most elegant woman in Chicago. Lydia pulled out one letter, placed it beside the 3 naked 7s, and the room seemed to tilt. The same 7 without a crossbar, the same lazy horizontal sweep on the letter T at the end of a word, the same compression of someone who wrote quickly and proudly. She wasn't a handwriting expert, she knew that, but she had spent her life reading numbers, and every professional cell in her body was screaming the same conclusion. The hand that had forged her father's signature 11 years ago did not belong to a dead man. It belonged to a living woman. Carmine Ruggiero had only been a front, perhaps a front even to his own wife. The mastermind had never been under the ground. The mastermind was preparing to stand beneath the lights of the Drake Hotel and speak about protecting children. She looked up and saw that Dario had somehow moved to stand beside her chair, his eyes going from the 3 pencil circles to the thank you letter, back and forth, twice, 3 times, and she saw something she had never seen on that motionless face before, a silent earthquake. For 10 years he had been digging a tunnel toward a dead man, while the true target had stayed alive, stayed smiling, kept sending invitations embossed in gold. He braced one hand on the desk very lightly, like a man who had missed a step in the dark, then pulled a chair down beside her, picked up her pencil, and the two of them worked until morning. No longer 2 people at opposite ends of the desk, but 2 heads bent over the same page, rebuilding the entire case in reverse, and under that reverse direction, everything suddenly fit with terrifying precision. The withdrawals always fell on days when the husband was away on business. The only ghost account remained active for 2 more years after he died, and there was an internal approval signature from 11 years ago, in the capacity of honorary secretary of the foundation board, Renata Ruggiero, the woman who had been in the engine room from the beginning, while the whole city saw only the man standing before the cameras. And as if that night had not already been long enough, near 4 o'clock in the morning, Tommy Falco's phone rang from the outer perimeter. The false information trap set the previous week had finally snapped shut. The third bait version, the hypothetical armored car transfer, had been triggered a second time through a more detailed plan sent to exactly one person. And tonight, the legal tracker Whitlock's team had installed by court order on the prepaid phone, once used to contact the man who had fallen into the trap, had rung in the one place no one wanted to believe. The 3-story townhouse of Chief Counsel Aldo Ferri, the 60-year-old man who had attended every Lombardi baptism. And when Tommy and 2 men quietly knocked on his door at dawn, Aldo Ferri opened it in his sleeping robe, looked at the 3 faces on his front steps, and collapsed onto his own threshold without anyone touching him. He confessed right there at the kitchen table, confessed the way a man vomits up something that has been lodged inside him for 11 years, saying that back then she had gotten hold of his fatal gambling debt, that she needed someone inside who knew Frank Kane's handwriting from the foundation contracts, that he had only passed along handwriting samples, only confirmed a few documents, that he had never thought anyone would die. He swore it, and for 11 years he had been her ear inside the Lombardi house, because that noose had never once loosened. By noon the next day, the entire crew crowded the mansion hallway, waiting for the law their world had enforced against traitors for 3 generations. Sal asked to handle it himself. Old Gino said nothing but stood blocking the garage door, and Dario Lombardi walked past all of them into the room where Aldo sat, slumped between 2 guards, looked at the old lawyer who had held him at his baptism, then took out a card, wrote, and placed it on the table in front of Tommy. Call Whitlock, hand him over with all his testimony, recordings and devices, intact down to the last hair. And when Tommy looked up with a question in his eyes, the question of the whole crew, of all 3 generations of the family, Dario wrote the second card, the one that would be passed through the entire organization that night like a new declaration. Blood can't wash Frank Kane's name clean. A courtroom can. The news that Aldo Ferri had been taken away by the FBI spread through the mansion before dinner, and with it came a truth Lydia pieced together for herself from the fragments she heard. That this arrest would go to court, that Ferri's name would be tied to the Lombardi name across the newspapers, that the media storm tightening around this house would grow twice as fierce. And at the center of that storm would be her and her son, the perfect excuse for every article, for the letter from the Department of Children and Family Services. For all of it, that night she sat for a very long time beside her son's bed, looking at his sleeping face, still marked with a smudge of chocolate at the corner of his mouth. Then she stood, brushed her hair back into place, put on the office blouse from that old Friday night, now washed and pressed flat, the way a person puts on armor, and went down to the study, where the yellow light still spilled through the crack beneath the door, as it had on every night of this winter. He was sitting behind the desk with the Ferri papers before him, and he looked up when she knocked, but she did not sit in the chair that had become hers through all those nights of reviewing files. She stood, her gaze unwavering and filled with a quiet, resolute strength, keeping the distance of a handover meeting, and said in the voice she had practiced in front of the mirror, level, tidy, with no opening for emotion to slip through, that she had come to say thank you and goodbye. Tomorrow, she and her son would leave. She had worked it out. They would truly go to her mother's aunt's house in Indiana, just as Mrs. Kowalski had once lied and said they had. It was far enough away for the reporters to lose interest, far enough away for that letter to become meaningless because the boy would have a new address, a new school, a normal life without iron gates and bodyguards. And as for him, she drew in a breath. She knew everything now, Mr. Lombardi. She knew who he had been to her father, knew how he had stood up and what it had cost him, knew about the 3-year fund, knew about the stack of files, knew all of it, and she had come to say what someone should have said to him 10 years ago, that he did not owe her father. He had been the only person to stand on her father's side. A person does not incur a debt by standing on the right side. But if he insisted on seeing it as a debt, then he had repaid it 10 times over. He had paid it with 3 years of anonymous funding, with a rescue, with her life and her son's childhood, so tonight she was releasing him in her father's name, in the name of the Kane family. She was clearing the debt, The books between their two houses were balanced. "Let me go," she said. "Let the scandal follow me. Let this house, Carmela, and the good people in this house have peace." When she finished, there was nothing left in the room but the sound of the fire, and she watched him do the thing he had done for 10 years. His hand reached out, took the fountain pen, drew the stack of white cards closer, the nib lowered to within a knuckle's width of the paper, and stopped. It stayed there, trembling once, very faintly, like a compass needle caught in a magnetic storm, and then before her eyes that hand set the pen down on the desk, aligned with the edge of the paper, decisive as a soldier laying down a weapon. He stood, came around the desk, each step slow and heavy, and stopped in front of her, closer than the distance of a handover, close enough that she had to lift her face. And between two breaths, the man who had been silent for a full decade opened his mouth. No, one word, and it sounded like nothing she had ever heard before. It was hoarse, cracked, forced out like a rusted door pushed open after 10 years locked shut, a word whose physical cost she could feel, whose scrape through his throat she could almost see as it came out, and she stood frozen while he swallowed hard, drew a long breath like a man preparing to dive, and spoke again, slowly, stumbling, each cluster of words feeling its way forward like a foot testing thin ice, saying that she said the books were balanced, but she had calculated wrong. For the first time in her life, Lydia Kane had miscalculated. A pause, a breath. It stopped being a debt a long time ago. "From the morning you told me I was over-mixing the batter." His voice broke there, and he had to stop, had to begin again. "You stood in my kitchen, in my house, knowing who I was, and still told me straight that I was wrong, without softening a single word. For 10 years this whole city has spoken to me through fear. Only you and the boy have spoken to me like I was a human being." A breath, a longer pause. "I stayed silent for 10 years and called it wisdom. It wasn't wisdom, it was fear. I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, I would ruin the thing I wanted to keep. And tonight you're standing here telling me to let you go so everything can be at peace. That is the same kind of wisdom, Lydia. Fear dressed up as kindness. I recognize it because I wore it for 10 years. He stepped back half a pace, as if to let her breathe, as if to let himself breathe, and the final sentence of that night came out steadier, still hoarse, perhaps always hoarse, but steady, saying that Renata Ruggiero had wagered her entire empire on one thing, on the belief that he would never dare speak again. This whole city had wagered on that same thing. She was about to lose that bet. And you, he looked at her, and in his gray eyes was a light she had never seen there before. "You can go wherever you want in 1 week, I won't keep you, but not now. Because this Saturday I need you and my aunt dressed beautifully, heads held high, and walking into the Drake beside me, and Lydia Kane." The woman who had spoken for both of them all winter stood in the middle of the study with her lips parted, and for the first time in her life could not say a single word. On Saturday night, the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel glittered like an enormous jewelry box, crystal chandeliers, a string orchestra, 500 of the most powerful figures in Chicago in formal dress, politicians, bankers, the lenses of the press lined along the red carpet, and at the center of it all, Renata Ruggiero in an ivory evening gown stood beneath the giant backdrop printed with the words, "For Chicago's Children," shaking hands, touching cheeks, standing at the very peak of her 20-year reign, while Sam remained at the mansion with Bettina and old Gino, promised a movie night with popcorn, completely unaware of the place his mother was walking into, and his mother, in a simple deep blue evening gown, her arm linked with Carmela's as the old woman wore black velvet, passed through the ballroom doors amid an undercurrent that spread faster than the music. People recognized them, people whispered. A cold space opened around the two women as if around something contagious. Backs turned, eyes swept over them and hurried away. And one grand lady whose daughter Carmela had once sponsored looked straight through the old woman as if looking through glass. But the two of them walked on, backs straight, chins raised, exactly as they had been told, and stopped in the middle of the ballroom, at the heart of that empty space, standing there, enduring it, until the whispers suddenly changed tone, because Dario Lombardi had just walked through the door. The entire ballroom watched the man in black formal wear cross the marble floor, people parting to clear his path by reflex, people guessing he had come because of some business courtesy, and would soon stand in a corner like the shadow he had always been. But he did not turn toward any corner. He walked straight ahead, past Lydia and Carmela with a nod, past the banquet tables, past Renata Ruggiero herself as her smile froze in the middle of an unfinished conversation, then went directly up the steps to the stage, and before the astonished master of ceremonies, took the microphone. The string music faltered and went silent, and in that moment, 500 of the city's most powerful people held their breath before a sight more than half of them had never witnessed. Dario Lombardi opened his mouth in public. "You will forgive me if I am clumsy." His voice came through the speakers, hoarse, cracked, like stone grinding against stone. "I have given up the habit of speaking, as all of you know." A nervous laugh somewhere died halfway through. "You have called my silence many things over the past 10 years. Arrogance, madness, calculation. Tonight I will tell you what it was. But first I have to repay a debt that is 11 years overdue." And his voice steadied with every sentence, like a man rediscovering an old rhythm of walking. 11 years ago, in a ballroom very much like this one, an honest man named Frank Kane was destroyed over $12 million he never stole. I was 26 years old then. I stood up and said he was innocent. I was right, but I spoke with nothing in my hands except belief, and you laughed. Some of you in this room tonight were there, and you laughed. My voice was so young that it was twisted into a weapon against the very man I was defending. I learned that truth without weight can kill, so I went silent, and I spent 10 years looking for weight. He raised a blue folder. Tonight, here it is. Frank Kane's original ledger, independent handwriting analysis, the bank statement chain of the ghost accounts, and the sworn testimony of attorney Aldo Ferri, the man who was coerced into providing signature samples all those years ago. All of it points to one truth. The person who forged Frank Kane's handwriting, the person who took $12 million in charity funds, and the person who 3 weeks ago ordered the kidnapping of his daughter, Auditor Lydia Kane, was not the man lying in the grave whom this entire city mourned. The ballroom roared as if a dam had burst, and he spoke through the noise, the sentence falling like a judge's gavel. "That person is standing in this room, in an ivory gown, beneath a sign that says for Chicago's children. And this entire file has been on the desk of the federal prosecutor's office since 6 o'clock this evening." The silence that followed was so thick that the sound of a champagne glass slipping against the edge of a table could be heard, 500 heads turning in one direction, and Renata Ruggiero stood there, alone in the middle of a crowd retreating from her with every breath, the smile still hanging on her face, though it had died from within. She opened her mouth and managed exactly 4 words. "How dare you fabricate?" Before the ballroom doors opened, and Dana Whitlock entered with 4 agents in dark suits along the red carpet, badges raised at chest level, and the arrest warrant and right to remain silent were read clearly beneath the chandeliers, right beside the For Chicago's Children backdrop. The handcuffs locked around wrists wearing pearled bracelets as cameras burst like fireworks, and the woman who had ruled the city's drawing rooms for 20 years was led away between 2 rows of people who had once bowed beneath her smile and now did not dare look straight at her. On the stage, Dario Lombardi waited until the noise settled, then spoke his final words before leaving the microphone, slowly, hoarsely, and with every word clear. "Not long ago, 12 doors in this city closed before a 9-year-old child looking for his mother in freezing weather, because you looked at his shoes instead of looking at him. I do not blame you. I was once like that too. I once thought silence before wrongdoing was wisdom. It is not, ladies and gentlemen. It is fear dressed in fine clothes." Then he set the microphone down, descended the stage steps, crossed the silent ballroom, went straight to the 2 women of his own house, offered one arm to his aunt and one arm to Lydia Kane, who was looking at him with eyes wet and shining in the chandelier light, and led them out through 500 people, none of whom still dared turn their backs. And spring came to Chicago the way it always came, slowly and without apologizing to anyone, the snow along the lakeshore retreating little by little into its last gray streaks. And on an April morning, after Renata Ruggiero had received a long sentence for conspiracy to kidnap and fraud in a trial where she had no smile left to wear, as a direct consequence of the investigation, Detective Ray Muller and his accomplices within the department were stripped of their badges and faced severe federal charges for abuse of power and collusion. On that same morning, a thick envelope bearing the seal of the federal court was delivered to the Lake Forest mansion, and Lydia Kane opened it in the kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning, beneath the familiar yellow light, reading the dry lines of justice, written in the language of legal documents, stating that every allegation in the old file concerning Mr. Frank Kane had been confirmed to rest on fabricated evidence, that his honor was fully restored before the law, for him and for his heirs, and the daughter who had kept her back straight for 11 years stood in the middle of the kitchen with the paper in her hand. And by the third time she read it, her shoulders began to shake, and she cried, not the kind of tears that fell silently, but the cry of a whole decade gathering at once, crying for the father who had sat staring at the wall in the final nights of his life, for the 18-year-old student who had quietly withdrawn from school, for all the doors that had closed. And Dario let her cry, did not offer a handkerchief, did not soothe her, only stood there like a wall a person could lean on if she chose, waiting until she could breathe again, and only then did he speak, in that hoarse voice that would always be hoarse, telling her the one thing he had kept until this very moment, that there was one more thing she didn't know, that he had gone to see her father 3 weeks before he died, a 26-year-old boy knocking on the door of a house where almost all the furniture had already been sold, that he could not clear her father's name then. He had nothing in his hands. All he could do was sit down in front of him and say that he believed him, that he knew he was innocent, and that he wouldn't stop until the whole city knew it too, no matter how many years it took. And her father had taken his hand and said, "Thank you, son. That is enough." And those were the last words Dario had spoken aloud to anyone, Lydia, for 10 years, until the morning her son knocked on his door. And Lydia understood that her father had not left this world believing the entire world had abandoned him. He had left with the hand of someone who believed him held in his own. And that was a gift greater than any paper of exoneration. In the weeks that followed, just as Dario had promised in the study that night, everything was returned to her: the compensation from the civil case, the job offers from the very firms that had once stayed silent, and a new apartment in a decent neighborhood that she put a deposit on with her own money. And then, on a Saturday morning, when she had regained everything and no longer needed anything from anyone, Dario Lombardi stood before her in the kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning and made the strangest proposal any woman had ever heard, saying that now she had her honor, her profession, and her home, she could refuse him without losing a single thing. And that was exactly why he had waited until today. He did not want her to choose him because she needed him. He wanted her to choose him because she chose him. And Lydia Kane did not answer right away. She went upstairs, brought down the wooden drawer, set it on the kitchen table, and opened before his eyes the whole winter arranged neatly inside, every card he had ever written, the card criticizing the batter, the card about page 41, the card about exceptions. And she said, "I answered you a long time ago. I was only waiting for you to ask out loud." As for Sam, when the two of them told him the news, he stayed suspiciously silent throughout breakfast, and then disappeared upstairs, before coming back down with a sheet of paper showing 3 crookedly drawn people holding hands in front of a house, with uneven letters beneath it that said "My family." And he handed it to Dario and asked the question that made Chicago's man of steel turn his face away for a long while. "Could you be my dad, please? I had to knock on 13 doors before I found you." 1 year later, in Pilsen, the Frank Kane Scholarship Fund for poor children in the neighborhood was inaugurated, founded openly by a family from Lake Forest. No longer hidden behind any post office box, the Lombardi family completed its withdrawal from every gray area and stepped fully into the light. And every morning, in the kitchen of the lakeside mansion, there were still 3 people beside the cast iron skillet: the man who spoke little but said what mattered, the woman who criticized the batter when criticism was needed, and the boy whose pancakes had become rounder, while on the kitchen wall, inside a simple glass frame, hung an old white card, the very first one, the card saying that the kitchen opened at 5 o'clock in the morning, because 12 families had turned away a boy after looking at his shoes, and one man who never spoke had said nothing at all. He had simply opened the door, and that had become the whole happiness of 3 lives. Our story closes here, and if it leaves anything behind, perhaps it is this: that we should never judge a person by their wet shoes or their worn coat, because behind every door we refuse to open there may be a life waiting for exactly one hand, that silence in the face of wrong has never been wisdom, and that the truest kindness is the kind that does not need an audience, does not need thanks, only needs to be done. And what about you? How do you feel about this story? Have you ever met someone in real life who spoke little but was kind through action? Or have you ever been the one who opened a door for someone? Share what you feel from deep in your heart in the comments, and let us know what city you are listening from. Don't forget to like, share this story with the people you love, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the moving news stories every week. Thank you for listening all the way to the final moment. I wish you and your family good health, joy, and peace every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.